And the conversations continue right here on Morning Express. We are glad you're watching KTN. It is indeed 8:17 a.m. Yeah, always good to keep you up to date with what's happening in terms of the time if you need to be somewhere. But we're glad you're watching, and remember we're online as well. I'm Sophia Wanuna. Chris Hart is with me on our conversation couch, and we're all about your relationships. What are those signs that it is dying, that the end is near? Chris, good morning.
Good morning.
No, the end of a relationship, love, is sad, but sometimes inevitable.
Yes, sadly, it is true. I mean, a lot of relationships do end. Half of them, broadly speaking, even the ones that have started off very successfully, half of them will come to an end.
Yes.
And the trick is to realize what you're doing during the relationship that is increasing the risk of that happening. Because as the risks start to pile up, there comes a point where there's a point of no return.
Yeah, and so then important is to look out, to be very aware and awake and sensitive to the relationship at every particular point.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, there are things very early in relationships where if you're not doing certain things, you're actually increasing the risks that things will go wrong later. And it's important that people realize that. I mean, for example, if very early in a relationship you don't make it clear what the standards of monogamy are, and if you don't start monitoring one another, and that sounds a little bit sinister, but you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, then the risks of that being a problem later are very serious.
Yeah, and you mentioned something, and by the way, just to remind you, if you're watching us this morning, you can be part of our conversation. Our numbers, phone lines are on your screen. Phone numbers. Call in. Well, it will be nice to talk to you and put your question to Chris or your comment as well. You mentioned something, and we're starting, is that the beginning of a relationship is already the potential end. The fact that it has started, then of course comes already with those risks.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there are a number of factors which increase the chances that a relationship is going to be very successful. So if you go against those, you're already starting on a difficulty. I mean, for example, it's good to have very similar backgrounds, very similar values. If you share values, chances of you falling out much reduced. If you are very honest with one another from a very early point in the relationship, if the trust builds that you can say anything to one another, you're doing well. So on the other hand, if you already only weeks into a relationship realize there are some things you can't talk about, or you're keeping something hidden, sooner or later that's going to be a big issue inside the relationship.
And some people get themselves caught up in these tricky situations where at the beginning they just say all these things or exaggerate on truths, and then with time they get to be really close to this person, and as time goes by they find it very hard then to retract or to actually clarify. By the way, what I said, it wasn't quite correct. What does that person do?
Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, if very early in the relationship you realize that's happening, I would actually end the relationship. You need early on to realize that you are able to be completely honest with one another. If that's not happening, then the relationship sooner or later will have a lot of sticky issues to deal with.
So you shouldn't feel the pressure from the beginning to be who you're not. It should always be about bringing me to the table with all my nasty and goes.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the signs that should shriek at you that this is really going to be a good relationship is right at the beginning you've started to feel that you can do that you can be 100% yourself. And also that you later on that you're beginning to talk about the things that really matter to you. That, for example, you're talking about your expectations in life. You're talking about, for example, the sort of family you want and where you want to live and how many children and when. If you can start talking about those sorts of things before you actually get married, then again things are likely to go well. If you're finding that you can't, that you're sensing that your path and his path are not quite right, then actually it's a very bad sign.
It's a bad sign. And Chris, would you say for the people who, for example, this man cheats on his wife with you and ends up leaving the wife to marry you or to be with you, is that also just from the very beginning going to be doomed?
No, not really. I mean, I hate to say it, but a huge number of people find themselves in that situation. And I know it sounds slightly strange, but in some ways, second marriages like that are more successful than first. Because,
but
of course,
they cheated. They always say if they cheated, he'll cheat on you as well.
Yes. I mean, that is true, but it depends on the circumstances. If you're with somebody whose lifestyle is cheating, who clearly enjoys going out every Friday night and going to the wrong sorts of bars, don't go very far with that person. But if this has happened once in their life, and clearly what it was a part of the process of ending a relationship, then don't worry too much about it.
All right. So from the beginning, we need to be aware how that relationship began, how we were able to communicate with this person. But for some, is as you go down the road, then certain things might start to, the alarms will go off. What are some of these alarms that would go off?
The alarm bells should go off. The trouble is that quite often we start doing these things without realizing that we're doing them.
Okay.
And a classic example of that, you see it happening all the time in public, is somebody who is treating their spouse worse than they treat their friends.
Wow.
When the phone rings, the smile comes up and they're very happy. Or when somebody comes across to greet them, the social skills all come out. And as soon as everybody's gone quiet again, this little row starts up again. As soon as you realize that sort of thing is beginning to happen in your relationship, you've got to deal with it.
Okay. And those who find themselves arguing about everything, the littlest of things, the big things, you're just constantly arguing. I see Chris and I'm like, oh, here we go again.
Yeah. Arguing itself is not an issue. In fact, it's quite dangerous to have a relationship where people don't argue. What happens if that's going on is one person is controlling the other. Somebody's being a doormat. Somebody's needs are not being met, and gradually they simmer away and there'll be an explosion sooner or later.
Okay.
So it's very important that couples actually put their issues on the table.
Have their differing opinions and be able to talk about
you're two independent people with different backgrounds, different histories. You're bound to see the world in different ways. It's very common, for example, for people to choose one another because they have different personalities. That inevitably means they'll see things differently. So discussing those differences is an important part of having a relationship. Where it starts to get nasty is where a simple discussion about something you and I disagree with starts to involve criticism. So instead of just discussing it, I'm starting to be rude to you. I'm starting to say that you are at fault. You are wrong, not that there is an issue we need to solve. I'm beginning to be critical of you.
Okay. So it's just about how you go about those fights. They will be there, but it's how you handle them.
Yes, really. Most of the time, if a discussion starts, it's because I want something. There's a wish involved. I want to do something differently or something like that. If I am putting that on the table, everything's all right. But if instead I'm saying you are doing something wrong, then we're actually going to start annoying each other a lot.
Okay. And then, of course, with the cheating, just to go back on that, when one person, one party, one spouse or girlfriend, boyfriend finds themselves interested in a different person, of course you feel guilty. For some, they will feel guilty at the beginning, but does that in itself indicate the end again is near for that relationship just because they find themselves interested in a different person? Or is that common, or is that something that you can wade through?
We're human beings, and it's impossible to switch off things like attraction. So if I'm walking down the street and a pretty girl walks by, it's absolutely 100% normal for me to think, wow, that's lovely, The same if I find myself sitting and talking to somebody over coffee and I'm finding that I'm enjoying this conversation. We might even start a tiny little bit of flirting.
Yes.
That is not a bad thing. It just proves we're alive. And it's enjoyable. It starts to be a bad thing when you begin to keep it a secret from your spouse. The moment you begin to think, I can't tell my spouse about this, I can't say that I had a conversation with somebody, I can't say that I met so-and-so, then you're beginning to slip over that divide where it's beginning to be a bit contentious.
And flirting online, chatting on Facebook.
To be truthful, we do it all the time, every day, and it's practically a normal part of everyday life.
Yes.
I mean, think of the number of times you felt good because somebody has flirted just a tiny bit with you.
Right.
That's normal.
Okay.
But if you're doing it a lot, if you're doing it with intent, if you're keeping it secret, then it's a different thing.
Then there's a problem. There are people who at the beginning put their best foot forward, and if it's a woman, she'll cook. she'll clean. She'll do all these things. And maybe it's just not in her makeup. It's not one of those things she loves to do, but because she's trying to impress the man, she will do these things. And the man also will pay the bills, the first date. But, you know, the second, third date, fourth date, he's talking about, how about today, honey, you treat me. Anyway, we'll talk about that. But let's talk to Dennis from USA. Minnesota. Dennis, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Are you from the Minnesota in Kenya or the real Minnesota?
I'm in Minnesota here in USA.
Well, we're glad you're watching and thank you for calling in. Please share with us your question or comment.
Yeah, is this Sophia?
Yes, it is. Go ahead.
Yeah, Sophia, how are you? I have this one more question.
I am great. Thank you, Dennis. What's your question?
So my question is, you know, what are some of the signs that your relationship might be collapsing? That's one of my questions. What are some of the signs that your relationship might be collapsing?
Okay.
And the second one is that what if you find out that the person whom you are in a relationship with is dominating the other? What do you do?
All right. Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah.
And we're glad you're watching us all the way from Minnesota, United States. Great. Thanks for calling in. So we'll start with the second question, dominating.
Yes.
The relationship. When you find out and feel this other person is dominating with decisions, perhaps, you know, with everything that matters most, then it's about them having their way. What do you do?
Well, it's a classic example of an issue that has to be put on the table. And I tend to describe it as something where, you know, you choose a very expensive restaurant and you buy a very expensive bottle of wine and you sit there together and you start to talk about it. You need to choose your moment. This is the key. If this is not something you start to bring up in a row, you actually bring it up when things are really nice and you start to say things very much from your point of view. It's not you're controlling me, it's I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable because we've done this, this and this. You see what I mean? And you don't roll it into a monumental complaint about everything. You are very specific about certain issues that have happened where you felt controlled. But the key, really, what lies behind his question, I think, is that if that starts to happen, if you're in a relationship which is very one-sided like that, it's going to be very unstable. That's the sort of relationship that can fail over a seemingly trivial issue. One day, a small argument suddenly blows up, and by evening, you're sleeping apart. So if you see that happening in a relationship, you must do something about it.
All right, and be able to talk about it, and not in an accusatory tone, just saying what it makes you feel.
Yeah, I mean, the other part of his question, there are 4 classic signs that show that a relationship is ending. The first one I've mentioned is the start of criticism. Later on, the criticism becomes contempt. You're not just simply saying you do something, you start saying you're stupid. And we can talk a little bit more about what contempt is. Then that leads to defensiveness. When I'm feeling criticized and people are being rude to me, I start to withdraw. And initially, I start to try and turn the thing back to you. I try and make excuses. And then eventually I give up. And I start stonewalling. And at that point, I'm withdrawing from the whole thing. Now, if you see any of those starting to happen in the relationship, they literally happen one after the other. If you see contempt, you're at step 1. If you see, step 2. If you see stonewalling, you're at step 4. Step 4, especially when the woman starts to stonewall, you're very, very close to the divorce courts.
Really? Break down for us stonewalling.
Stonewalling is when you and I start an argument and it quickly escalates. There's a lot of heat, there's a lot of tempestuous comments, there's a lot of very bad sort of body language, your eyes are rolling, you're sneering, you're saying all sorts of nasty things to me, and I can't stand it. And nothing I seem able to say is making any difference in the argument. My temperature's rising too. And then I start to think the only way out of this is I stop. I just simply stop engaging with you. And so I think of excuses, I look busy, I leave, I get angry to the point where the whole conversation stops. Then I'm stonewalling. I'm refusing to engage with the issues that you're trying to raise.
Okay.
Men are particularly prone to that, by the way. I mean, how many times have you heard a woman saying, he won't talk about it?
Yeah.
The guy's stonewalling.
Shut down.
He has shut down. Now, you cannot believe how close you are to a tragedy once you get to that point.
All right. So there should always be that room to talk, to conversate, to have a discussion. And the minute somebody feels there's no point, then they're tired.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds a bit prescriptive, but I'm not joking when I say that those 4 things I mentioned are the signposts on the way to the divorce courts.
Okay.
So if you start realizing that you're criticizing your partner, if you're being criticized, if you start realizing that you are being contemptuous of one another, you're sneering, you're name-calling, you're insulting, if you start realizing that your partner's being defensive, or you're being defensive, 1, 2, 3, 4 is stonewalling, 5 is the divorce court.
Yes. Let's talk about how to avoid getting to that end and criticizing. It will begin innocently. It will be, you know, you didn't do this. You know, why is that? And then the next thing, you're so stupid. Why didn't you do this? You know, like, you just never get it. Then it will keep escalating. So
yes, I mean, the key sign is that you're not actually acknowledging that there's a shared problem here. If when I raise something, I start by saying, I'm upset about something, then I'm taking my share of the responsibility for what's going on. The moment I start saying, you are doing this, that, and the other, I'm criticizing. So it's the change from I to you that is one of the first signs that that's beginning to happen.
Okay, when you're the bad guy, it's all you.
You're the bad guy, exactly. You're seeing it as something you are doing wrong rather than something that needs to be solved.
That needs to be solved. So what kind of language, when the partner, either your partner is doing something that you don't like, that's upsetting you, how do you then address that?
Well, the first thing is to clearly put on the table what it is you want. So if somebody is coming home late, don't say you're always late. That's criticism. Say, I really would like it if you got home at a certain time, and you say why and what it is that it means to you. You try and engage them in a thing that you would like to have rather than telling them that they're wrong.
Okay. No, so
Makes
saying,
sense?
you're late again, like every other day.
The moment you start saying you're late, or whatever,
All the time.
I start to think of excuses. You know, I don't think about what it's doing to you. I start giving you reasons why I have to be late. You know, I'll start saying about how hard I'm working and I've got to do business and I must meet my friend and all the rest of it. I'm not actually trying to solve your problem. I'm making excuses.
Yes, and defensive. When the person you notice all the time will make excuses, will, you know, say all this manner of things. How does that, as a person who's making excuses, how do you get out of that position, and how do you make your partner not feel the need to be
You know,
defensive?
it's actually very difficult because invariably defensiveness comes after you've been criticized and people have been rude to you. So by the time you get to that point, you're actually feeling pretty sore about it all. You know? And so it's going to be very difficult to back off from those positions. You're going to have to start trying to say to each other how important you are to one another. You're going to have to try and recreate some of the affection that was there before. Because by the time you're being defensive, you've started to forget what you like about one another. You've begin to forget what it was that brought you together in the first place. You can't anymore see each other's good points. You're beginning to focus on the bad points. And you've got to unwind all of that. Now, to be honest, that's actually quite difficult.
And you know, Chris, most times when couples fight, and as everything else in life, when something bad is happening, our mind and the focus in our world shifts to what's wrong. And that's where then you'll find a fight will be aggravated, because then you forget about all the good of what's working and it's all about what's not working. So how does a couple, because there will be many things that won't work, there will be many things that will go wrong in a relationship. So for a couple that would want to make something and their relationship work, how do you resolve those kind of situations without necessarily making it spiral into something bigger?
Well, it depends, as I say, where you are on that sequence. The further down the sequence you are, the things you're going to have to do are going to have to be much more positive, and they're going to be much more difficult. So the starting point is to try and nip it in the bud, is to try to see it happening at an earlier stage. So if you begin to realize that the you statements are beginning to creep in, you really want to take a little bit of a check at that point and say, hang on, what am I doing here? And you have to start re-energizing some of the things you used to say to one another and used to do together.
Okay.
You know, one of the real problems is this. If I am criticizing you, the chances are I'm talking about things that you're not aware of. So you actually don't believe me. You see, for example, if you've started to develop some rather unpleasant body language, like you're beginning to roll your eyes at me and things like that, you don't really realize you're doing it.
Yes.
And when you do realize, you think it's a bit funny, but in reality it's having a big effect on me. And when I say that to you, of course you don't believe me. You start thinking, why are you picking on me? Why are you telling me things that aren't true? It's very difficult to unwind those arguments.
Yes.
And the trick, as I say, is you've got to go back to the affection and the connection that was there before.
Okay, yeah, probably a good time to go for a date night. Let's talk to Divina from Kisii. Divina, good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for calling.
Hi, Sophia.
Morning, how are you?
I'm fine. I wanted to ask,
Yes.
when someone in your marriage, what do you do? And the other thing, is it normal for someone to cheat on the first year of marriage?
For somebody to do what?
Cheat on you on your first year of marriage?
Okay, and the first question, Divina, you're asking what do you do about what?
When someone beats you in your marriage?
Beats you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Divina, for calling. We appreciate. So there are two issues here.
Yes.
Beating, cheating. Let's start with the beating.
Okay. I mean, first of all, it's completely out of order.
Yeah.
There are no circumstances in which it's acceptable to be violent in a relationship. Having said that, it's very easy for people to get pushed up against the wall and to really start fighting. I don't know many relationships in which there haven't been a few broken plates.
Really, that's bad.
Yes, it's really true. I mean, you take things to the point where people are beginning to shout, something's going to get broken. But now, you have to distinguish between the sort of not that important violence that occurs really in the heat of the moment and something which is being repeated. There's this thing called the cycle of abuse.
Okay.
And what it means is that you have some sort of incident, and then the day after everybody's terribly sorry and everybody's very lovey-dovey and sweet, and then the tension starts rising again and it happens again a little while later. Once that happens, the relationship really has to end. Unless you are able to get some really serious professional help and people really change, the relationship is going to go very, very bad.
Yes.
And in fact, it can turn into one of those relationships where, you end up in the hospitals.
Yeah, and it's important to even report to the authorities. I mean, beating, that is wrong. It should not even be happening.
It should not happen.
Yeah.
And it is, as I say, it's especially dangerous when it is starting to be repeated.
Yes.
Just once, in the heat of a terrible argument, I think that's okay.
Yeah.
Starting to happen regularly, it's not okay.
Yeah, because it will start with one slap, the next time it's, slap here, and then it gets worse. So important to keep check on that. Cheating on the first, did she say the first day of marriage?
I mean, I hate to say this, but there's a lot of cases of little shenanigans with the bridesmaids and things like that.
Oh my.
These sorts of things are very common. Cheating is a very strange thing. If it happens once or twice in a relationship, you can almost regard that as normal. I know that sounds awful, but
It does sound awful,
but the plain
Chris.
fact is, almost all marriages have some degree of some small amount of cheating happens at some stage in a very long marriage. When it becomes a lifestyle, way different. So the moment you begin to realize that, okay, one incident, a lot of painstaking talking and thinking, and it's over, fine. But if it's happening again and again and again, different situation altogether.
All right, Chris, we must bring this to a close, but not before. For you, bottom line with a relationship, it really boils down to the two people wanting it to work and doing their very best. And also, in some cases, it will be one partner expecting the other one to initiate the process of conversation, of mending, the rift. But it should be that taking that, being the bigger man, if you like, being humble enough, putting down the pride and saying, I'm going to initiate this. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's certainly true. I think the key is this. When you are starting a relationship, you should be very aware of the things that you are doing that might mean disaster in future.
Yeah.
If you realize you're lying, you're not in the right relationship. If you realize you can't talk about everything, you're in the wrong relationship. When the relationship is well and truly advanced and you begin to realize that you're criticizing or being rude, you must start to do something about it.
Yes.
These things are highly predictive of divorce. So if people are rolling their eyes and sneering and insulting, I'm afraid it is the strongest single predictor of divorce there is. So what you must do in a relationship is be nice to one another. And the moment you begin to realize that's not happening, do something about it.
Okay. I know my director will kill me, but Karani has asked several questions here. You know, Kate, talking about, I have a boyfriend, we've been dating for about over 2 months, and he's been to my house, spent over several times, but I've never been to his house. We've fought about it, but he still has not taken me there. Is this a sign that there's something being hidden, and is the relationship going to end?
I think the simple answer is yes. I'm enormously suspicious about people who aren't totally open about their circumstances.
Yes.
So the moment I've got close to you, I should know where you live, you should know where I live, we should have gone and visited all the places we hang out, you should know where I work, you should know my friends, you know. If that's one-sided and you're keeping everything very secret, I should start thinking about second families, con merchant, disasters.
Con merchant. Very well said. We have to wind it up there. Chris Hart, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again next week. We must take a short break now, but of course, Serenganga Sleepy will still be coming up on Bangla. We're glad you're watching, and stay with us right here on KTN.